Hello everyone, my name is John Higgins and this is a strategic analysis for the 171st Air Refueling Wing based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the history of the 171st was actually founded and goes back to almost the founding of the Air Force itself. In 1946 there were 10 officers and 12 enlisted airmen that formed a fighting squadron here at the site of the old Pittsburgh Airport and began flight training on the P-47 aircraft. Since 1947, the unit has flown 16 different aircraft and have had 8 different missions assigned to them since that time. In 1976, though, there was a significant turning point because the Department of Defense redesignated the Air National Guard to become a part of the total force in order to be more integrated with the Air Force as a whole. The 171st Air Refueling Wing then was born that year in 1976. And since 9/11, September 11, 2001, the 171st has really been busier than ever. It is the largest wing in the Air National Guard with around 400 full-time and 800 part-time personnel. There's also 2 lines of aircraft alerts that operate 24/7, and it's one of the highest operational units in the Air National Guard. To highlight some of the accomplishments and feats that they've accomplished there's been more than 20,000 missions, 77,000 flying hours, and 150 million pounds of fuel distributed since 9/11. And that's one of the highest mission executions in the Air National Guard. They've also had more than 8,000 members deployed worldwide since September 11th, 2001. Also one of the highest numbers deployed in the Air National Guard, and it's ranked in the top 1% for safety in the Air Force, which is an impressive feat for how many missions that they've accomplished. So in order to understand how the 171st fits, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Department of Defense that owns the 4 military departments, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force. The DoD is the world's largest employer, 3.2 million personnel, and maintains 561,975 facilities. Their budget is $576 billion. So it's only followed by the People's Republic of China's Army for the 2nd largest in the world, and then by Walmart for the 3rd largest in the world. The DoD's budget itself outstrips that of Exxon and Walmart combined together there. Under the Air Force, there are major commands which are responsible for pretty much the execution of the Department of Air Force missions, administrative tasks, and other types of fulfillment tasks in there. So you see some of their numbers for those agencies as well. And then within the Department of the Air Force, you'll have the Air National Guard as a reserve component of the DAF, and they have a budget of $7.7 billion, with $4.1 billion going to personnel, and then another $3.6 billion going to operations and maintenance. Also below the Department of the Air Force, as one of the MAJCOMs, is the Air Mobility Command, which is a major command subordinate to the DAF. The major commands are kind of broken out into functional activities. So, for instance, you would have if it was a fighter jet, it would fall under the Air Combat Command. Mobility aircraft fall under the Air Mobility Command. So how the 171st fits into that whole big picture, the 171st is subordinate to both Air Mobility Command and also the Air National Guard when necessary. Typically, it's not a rule, but typically Air Mobility Command will direct those federal missions and then also own the aircraft assets, and they will fund any resources necessary to provide the support to the missions that they direct. On the other hand of it, the Air National Guard will direct domestic missions, and they own all the facilities and fund the staffing of the personnel. So they're kind of the HR function to it as well. And on the right there, you can see where some of those how some of that money trickles down from the big Department of Air Force budget. So some of the strategic issues that are out there right now for the 171st, even though the 171st would be considered lean and pretty effective at accomplishing its mission because of its sheer size and the number of resources it has against the competition, it does have some strategic issues that it needs to concern itself about for the long term and really the short term as well. The 171st does not have a documented short or long term strategy. and that can cause a lot of bigger issues for the organization, such as how they're going to anticipate change coming, how they can avoid confusion with their employees, and how they can remain viable. Those are all pretty good strategic questions for the 171st to answer. So the competition for the 171st, first it would be considered all air mobility wings, as I mentioned, within the Air Mobility Command, and then we could still further distill that down to only the aerial refueling wings within Air Mobility Command, and further condense it down to only Air National Guard air refueling wings that fly the KC-135. So of that, we'll analyze two wings that meet that definition, and then an active duty wing. Really, I'm going to look at that just for comparison purposes to show the differences between budgets and resources for the missions that are flown. So the first competitor that's out there is the 101st Air Refueling Wing, which operates out of Bangor, Maine. And they have a similar history to the 171st, but only operate about 2/3 of the aircraft, and they only have 900 personnel as opposed to that 1,200 at the 171st. And you can see their mission statement and their vision statement. Mission statement is very detailed. They provide all the missions that they support within that statement, so you really get a clear picture and a story on what that wing can provide. Okay, the next is the 151st Air Refueling Wing. They operate out of Salt Lake, Utah, and they have a similar mission set as the 171st. Also has the alert lines and deployment numbers, but again, with a smaller aircraft fleet size and a smaller number of personnel, around 900, makes them a little bit more similar to the 101st. And again, their mission statement really hits on all the critical to success factors that you would look at from an industry perspective. The vision as well is pretty clear cut and really shows what they believe in: personnel professional growth, fostering strong, vibrant community partnerships, and hitting on some of those critical to success factors. Okay, and finally here is the 22nd Air Refueling Wing. They are an active duty unit, so they're by very nature going to have a lot more resources, and you can see that their fleet size is 2.5 times that of the 171st, and they employ about 3 times the personnel as the 171st does, with 3,400 personnel. Economic impact is about 5 times the 171st, $562 million. But however, they do not execute 2.5 times the missions or have 5 times the missions as the 171st. So that's going to play in here in a little bit on these slides. Okay, so the 5 forces, I tweaked these around to be a little bit more similar to a service company in a nonprofit industry, and the reason for that is because the funders are more appropriate here than saying suppliers. In addition, the threat of competing needs is also more appropriate since, as I mentioned, everyone is competing for that share of the pie from the Department of Air Force budget. Both of these items hold the greatest influence on the organization, and the 171st needs to keep the funders happy, which are kind of your customers or your stakeholders in there, but also your supplier, so they can be the two roles there. So if they keep them happy by continuing to execute the missions with the funds and providing a value for the funds that are provided, then that keeps them happy. And in addition, other wings are trying to compete directly for the same funding, so they're going to try to take some of those missions and try to separate themselves and position themselves ahead of competing needs for that same piece of pie. Okay, the PESTEL analysis also shows the impact of the funders here under the political section, specifically how they directly impacted by those political leaders. And here the recommendation is to engage early and often with the funders and the political leaders to try to get the 171st story out there, get the history out there, get the mission execution out there, show what kind of value they're providing as opposed to the active duty unit. Other threats such as social issues, you can look at those as either a threat or a opportunity. But by staying ahead of those items and being first at the table with them, they can really leverage themselves into the future. The internal environment, the organization is established into 4 groups with 10 squadrons. Each group and squadron receives a percentage share of the overall budget that's coming in. And significantly, since this is not a top-down hierarchy, but instead a more flat of a hierarchy, there's limited personnel to accomplish the mission. So if you remember how I compared the 171st to an active duty unit that was 3 times or 5 times as large, this is where that plays in. Now you're going to have one person trying to accomplish the job of 3 people, or maybe even 5, 6, 7 people. So that could be good or bad for having a decentralized execution structure like that. It can be good for quick decision making, but it can also be bad because there's no top-down strategy coming down without the long-term or short-term strategic plan that's out there, and that tends to lead to confusion, but more importantly, it also tends to lead to on-the-fly management. So instead of being ahead of issues, they're constantly trying to react to issues. Here's the 171st mission and vision statement. The mission is to enable global reach through superior air refueling expertise, and the vision is to provide the best mission support in domestic and international operations in the Air Force. So both of these statements are pretty weak in my opinion compared to the competition. The competition, as I mentioned, does include a lot of critical to success factors where there's none in these statements here other than accomplishing the air refueling mission, which is only one of the missions that the 171st would undertake. So overall, they're too simple, and they don't really have that punch in your gut type of a story that's being told here. And it doesn't tell the story where the organization is going or where it wants to go or what the future is going to hold for it. The balanced scorecard I also tweaked a little bit. You see the headers there: executing the mission, managing resources, leading people, and improving the unit. So I tweaked these to fall in line with the overall Air Force balanced scorecard and what the Air Force would look at from their individual wings. So the Air Force doesn't really look at financial measures. Instead, the Air Force is going to look at resources. So how are you executing the budget? And then also, how are you maintaining your equipment inventories? Are there control measures in place? Are you being a good steward of the taxpayers' money? So these fall better in line with that. And then what can happen here is once the organization decides those critical to success factors, which I've mentioned earlier, they can go and look out for goals and then objectives, and then place those goals and objectives under the appropriate heading. So if it's aerial refueling, then you could place that under executing the mission, and then what needs to happen in order to accomplish that. Do you need pilots? Do you need maintenance personnel? Do you need to bring up your aircraft maintenance status? Okay, the SWOT analysis shows a number of very strong strengths, and then a good number of weaknesses, though, as well. But a lot of those weaknesses really are revolving around the lack of strategy and the legacy culture that exists within the organization. So overall, the organization here should work towards developing that strategy with steering committees and trying to work towards a more agile culture. And I think all that could come with developing a strategy and then communicating it out to the employees. The 4 factors also kind of tell a similar story of the SWOT. And as I mentioned, what the 171st would need to do here is to create some long-term strategic roadmaps with goals, priorities, and objectives, and then follow those up into the balanced scorecard, and then get the planning and steering committees formed around those goals and objectives, and develop new program points of contact for them to track those. So they should all be SMART objectives. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So overall, it's recommended the 171st develop a stronger mission and vision statement, as I mentioned, and encompass some of those critical to success factors. Efficiency-wise and execution-wise, there's really not much that needs change there, but the culturally and organizationally, structurally, it does need to change. And you could do that by utilizing some of the tools that we mentioned within this briefing: the SWOT, the PESTLE, the 4 factors, the balanced scorecard, and then try to identify those areas of opportunity which we can use to leverage as strengths against some of the competition that's out there. Thank you.